I'm from the Philippines. I'll be the chair and facilitate the round. The judges can introduce themselves.
Hi, I'm Catherine.
Hi, I'm Tamkeen. She, they, please.
Thank you, judges. I'll just use gender neutral pronouns and just say speaker for everyone when calling you and when thanking you for your speech. I think POIs, just a reminder, are to be written down in the chat. So when you speak, you can look at the chat to accept or offer POIs. With that said, I think everyone is here. Everyone is ready, unless you say otherwise. Without further ado, we'd like to call Prime Minister to open the debate on the motion that stands in their name. Here.
Cool. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Great. Then I'm going to start in 3, 2, 1. On panel, consumer welfare standards only works because there is a presumption that normally working democratic process can prevent the companies from doing any kind of abuse later on when they consolidate a lot of stuff and become big. At the point at which those companies directly threaten the ability of your voters and your Senate, whatever other arguments, to have a democratic process, that means that this process stops working, and that means at this point they must stop. So what kind of companies we're talking about? We realize that there are two key types of companies that we're talking about in this debate. First of all, those are informational companies. So for example, companies such as Facebook, etc., that do a lot of problematic stuff. They allow fake news to proliferate and don't introduce any meaningful policies against having that. They do allow foreign investment into political campaigning directly during the election process, but also otherwise. Beyond that, we believe that not all technological companies function that way. Say places such as Twitter do not allow political advertisement. They also do introduce like things such as fact checking, etc. So we probably would not be touching them. What we would do is we would give other companies that do not comply some time in order to introduce such alike policies that are likely to reduce those things that do directly harm democracy, in our opinion. And unless they manage to do that, which they have a giant incentive to do so, we're going to break them up into multiple different divisions, into smaller companies that like Facebook Mobile, Facebook, like whatever, that is just going to destroy their business. So it's likely that they're going to comply. Second thing that we're talking about are companies that hold too much of a major market in the country, so that they can basically dictate whatever is happening inside of the country because of the fact that they just hold so much power in it, which means that, for example, a lot of oil companies would fall into this, a lot of conglomerates of agricultural sectors would fall into this sector. Those companies are also extremely harmful as they have disproportionate lobbying power, and therefore we believe it's important to break up them as well, right? I believe what happens to them at the moment is, and to characterize them, is that they use their current position as very rich, very big companies that are technically protected by the law to stomp on their competition, right? Say by buying out smaller upcoming companies that are not directly threatening them at the moment and do not directly violate this law because nothing is changing over price on the market, etc., but might potentially later on become problematic towards them and merge with them without any problems, as in, for example, when Facebook buys out other social media such as Instagram, such as WhatsApp, etc., which allows it to effectively hold basically a monopoly on amount of users that it has in the US or just around the world. We believe it's extremely problematic. Before I continue on with what we do, I'll take over.
Yeah, who exactly is going to decide what is deemed too much dangerous for the democratical procedure? What kind of committee? Who is going to complex it? What are the guidelines? Something.
I think we as opening government do define that because we have the fiat to do so, but if you want a more complicated answer, really is that we can come up with a comprehensive list of things, like we can call up an academic scholarly like giant body that is going to evaluate what things do systematically harm the democratic process on the base of research that can be very efficiently done comparatively in all states around the world. Look up what are those factors most usually, and then going from there, we're going to decide whether the company is good or bad by one-to-one reviews of every company. So we believe that something like that is going to work. So what happens in the status quo? First of all, let us talk about problems that informational companies bring in. So I believe that voters just lose the ability to access information that is correct or just processable to themselves to find out what's true and what's wrong, and that harms them significantly, right? Because most people do rely on social media in order to get their news in the 21st century. Even if you try to go to websites of whatever, like outlets such as BBC, etc., most often you do that through the pages in social media that you're linked in, like BBC page in Facebook, from which you go to those websites, which means that you still see like a lot of content that is exclusive to their social media pages, but also that means that you see a lot of stuff that is not only about those publications, because secondly, with most social media has pervasive data collection and advertisement recommendation, or just in general recommendation algorithms that natively fit into the feeds of people, as in they don't try to showcase that it is an advertisement post anyhow very much clearly. They just blend into with other posts that people are seeing in those feeds, which means that it's extremely likely that a lot of people do perceive this information as something that is coming natively from their feed, together with those things that they're consuming on the daily basis. Especially that affects older people that are not as tech savvy, but it's also just a very efficient thing. Otherwise, those companies wouldn't be doing that, which means that advertisements there, but also all other kinds of posts there, are extremely efficient in shaping public opinion, which means that in case if those opinions are being shaped by actors that do directly try to sell you information that is untrue, it's likely that you're going to buy into that information, which means that your decision making later on that directly affects you and lives of your family, etc., is going to be based upon premises that are just not true, which means that it's going to be irrational, which means that it directly erases the fact that you can have any kind of democratic change in your country, because democracy does rely on the fact that people can do rational decision making, right? Secondly, we believe when companies become incredibly big, governments become really beholden to them, right? Why? Is because economic losses are directly related to those government in overwhelming most of cases, right? Rarely people do actually blame companies for economic loss. Economic performance of the country is almost always linked to personal loss, like prime minister, presidents, political parties, etc. Which means that in case if one like company has a ton of ability to exert power over economics of your country, it has a ton of ability to exert power over political actors there, because political actors want to get re-elected. In most, for example, democracies that are not as big, such as post-colonial democracies, they most usually have a transnational company, or like big, like local, like post-communist giant, like company that is just a remnant of like their historical legacies that exerts such amount of power, which means that it can easily threaten the government with, say, pulling out some kind of operations, trying to sabotage their functioning, etc., unless they're going to give it whatever things that it demands, which are most usually bad regulations that allows them to exploit workers further, and those things directly harm people that are unable to resist against that, right? Secondly, just very simply, they can out-lobby every other competitor in the market anyway if they're on such a big scale, which means that they can vote in agreeable presidents or parties anyway, which means that it's very much likely that they're again going to get those things that only help their incentives but not democratic incentives of the people, because those people are not likely to go and have much choice, given that all of the alternative candidates are going to be extremely underfunded in campaigning, are going to be less likely to be seen on media and just have very low chance of winning otherwise, which means that it directly reduces the choice of people, which again directly reduces their democratic engagement and ability to have a better life. With not having those things as great, with this motion is also great. Vote OG.
We thank the speaker for the speech. To continue the debate and open it for opposition, we call the leader of opposition here.
Am I audible?
Yeah.
Okay. 3, 2, 1, go. 2 points in my speech. Firstly, why this is going to be a very abusable system that is likely to be abused politically. Secondly, economically speaking, why we think that the big companies are the greatest thing happening to the economy and why we shouldn't break them according to this metric. Before that, few points of external rebuttal. So firstly, and this entire idea, which was, by the way, the only logical link we got from opening government as to why we can't simply regulate these companies is because they are too big, right? They have lobbies and whatever. I want to flag why this particular link, which was the only one given from opening government on this one, is completely symmetric. This debate only takes place at the position at which these companies have already become big, right? They do not get an opening government to claim some sort of a time machine that would have enabled them to see preemptively that Facebook or Google or whatever is going to become immensely big, right? Even if they do have experts, no one can know this in advance, meaning that they only get to decide that some company is risky to the economy after it is already very big and is able to afford lobbyism, etc. Insofar as they have the fiat in this position to still break down these companies, we have at least as much fiat, if not more, to take the more moderate step of just regulating it. Secondly, on regulations, to be clear on what is our stance in opposition in this debate, we are happy to defend any regulation that is objective and applicable similarly to all companies, meaning that we are happy to defend just banning companies funding political campaigns. We are happy to defend banning fake news. We are happy to defend banning price plummeting and every other sort of mechanism OG describes as a non-competitive mechanism. What we don't approve is letting a politically nominated committee to decide when and when not to do so. What we disapprove of is the cherry picking that opening government enables the politicians to do, meaning that they need to explain and they have the burden to explain why just regulating and banning the procedures or the very mechanisms that make something uncompetitive is not enough, given that it is the same fiat, if not more fiat on our side. Lastly, they just assert that the company being so big means that it has literally no competition and complete control. Please note, Amazon, which is like the first example we often have in mind in this debate, still needs to compete with Alibaba and AliExpress, etc. We think that the way that the market works today is there are so many different companies that are huge. Google, Facebook, Twitter, whatever, you have so many of them. And particularly they are directly competing with one another, meaning that they have an incentive to block one another's lobbyism. If Amazon wants to lobby for a regulation that is going to benefit it on the account of everyone else, all other businesses are going to lobby against this particular regulation, meaning that we have the market fixing for itself here. We don't need their government intervention. Let's talk about why do we think this mechanism is extremely abusable. So firstly, on this independent committee of experts, now obviously they're still going to be nominated by politicians, even if there's going to be some inspection process. Please note, like the most inspected process with most checks and balances probably is the nomination of the US Supreme Court judges, and we still see that every Republican nominates a Republican judge and vice versa, right? We think that at the point at which just because of blatant corruption, but B, even if we assume the best politicians out there, they just have opinions that they can't control, they just really think that this expert is better because they agree with them, they are going to just nominate people that are more aligned with their political ideology. Secondly, note how vague the criteria that they give is. At the point at which all they need to do is to prove something to be deemed as undemocratic, so many companies could be explained to be potentially too big to fail. So many companies, look what currently Trump is doing with Twitter, or look what currently Duterte is doing in the Philippines with the anti-terror act. The fact that nearly every sort of opposition to the ruling party could be colored as a potential threat to democracy makes it easy to abuse. Secondly, just the fact that most voters usually don't hold politicians accountable for these particular regulations, right? Because they vote once every 4 years on the big issues. No one is going to prioritize in the voting booth what is their specific nominee for this specific committee. They're going to vote on the big issues such as security, the economy as a whole, etc. So voters aren't even that aware of this process to hold politicians accountable, meaning that given this combination of factors and the already hatred that most people have towards big companies, it is very easy to demonize them because they are perceived in the public eye often as like these bad capitalists taking advantage of the economy, etc. It is so easy to color anyone you so wish as a threat to democracy. At the point that is you can do that, you can be selective. And we think at the point at which you have committees that are likely to choose selectively to maybe break up companies such as Twitter, but not companies that are very similarly big such as Fox, because this is more in line with the political opinion that they come with, you have more of an ability to tweak the political opinion in the public spectrum. Why is it important? Because we win on comparative. Because yes, perhaps these companies have a lot of power today, but as I flagged in the rebuttal, they at least compete with one another. We have a free market not only of companies, but of ideas. Tomorrow they create a monopoly of the same companies with the same amount of influence, but only for one opinion, because they are able to take out the companies that are not convenient to them and leave the companies that are convenient to politicians, meaning that we get all their outcomes so much worse. Before I move on, I'd love to hear Sage's extension.
Okay, so do you think that you are still able to protect consumer welfare in your world?
Yeah, definitely. I just explained this in the rebuttal, but I'm also going to have a constructive point on why consumer welfare is better on our side. Let's talk about economy. Firstly, economy of scale. An inherent impact in this debate is you just break big companies quite often, right? We think that big companies are just great for the economy and for people as a whole for several reasons. First, because they have an economy of scale, they just can afford to give much cheaper products, right? Because they can use the same amount of money, but with a bigger bargaining power in order to create more of less and actually give cheaper life for the people. Secondly, safety net for innovation. At the point at which you are so big, such as Google, you are more able to do things such as projects such as Google Car, Google Glasses, etc., because you have a safety net to fall back on, which small companies don't do as much because they can't afford to take those risks. Thirdly, the global trade. At the point at which you are big enough, you are more able to actually export and import from across the world, actually improve the situation in developing countries, which would otherwise never benefit from this because they never benefit from the high quality of small businesses in the West, which are not able to actually trade with them. But when you have a very big chain of suppliers, you are more able to actually benefit the situation of everyone. But secondly, regardless of economy of scale, we think that just at the point at which you break these companies, they're going to become completely futile and very unbeneficial to the economy because they lose their connections, they lose their consumer base, they lose their management facilities because they're no longer in attachment with one another. They don't have the same manager. They need to restart themselves again. Many of them will simply fail, meaning that many workers will simply lose jobs and we lose so much of the benefit that they currently provide. But just in terms of incentives, we think that once we make the market so much less predictable because it is such an arbitrary thing that note, even if it is not abusable, you think it might be abusable, it's enough, right? At the point at which you know that tomorrow a politician might abuse it based on a win, even if it is never done so, this is the point at which investors are much less willing to take the risk actually involved in actually developing a company within our country because they fear that it will tomorrow be broken up. And of course, less incentive to actually do anything that might be perceived as political, such as philanthropy, because it is often to do with human rights. Beg you to oppose.
We thank the speaker for the speech. To continue the debate, we'd like to call the Deputy Prime Minister. Here.
Okay, am I audible?
Yeah.
Oh, 3, 2, 1. The problem with opening opposition's responses is that it is true that you can regulate on both sides of the house. The problem is that regulation is always going to be under specific political constraints, that lobbying can still happen even if you buy financial, even if you limit the amount of political contributions. Look at the United Kingdom, Conservative Party is just awash with black money, etc., that comes from different types of sources. There are limits as to lobbying, as to what is exactly lobbying, are charitable donations lobbying, etc. There are limits as to the fact that certain political parties just cooperate with big businesses, etc., in order to really bona fide, create good actual policy that they want. So this means that lobbying probably happens on both sides of the house to the same extent. The question is, what is the best way to do this? Opening up says you can regulate these companies and prevent them from raising their prices. We say no. The best way to do that is by breaking them up, is to remove the incentives that these companies have in order to limit consumer preferences. It would be a safer choice because it just removes the incentives of the company to screw up the consumer, than to rely on the fact that politicians will have high integrity or will be able to withstand the tides of the political process. What do we say specifically in our case? So opening up, to their case, opening up says you will selectively interpret certain types of companies and use the majority opinion to undermine your political opponents. We think that it is reasonable that this is not going to be like 4 kinds of type of situation. We think that we'll install some kind of veto mechanisms for smaller political parties. We'll make sure that it's impossible to just break up your own political media. We think that it is just unreasonable to expect us to defend the kind of policy where, because you win the election, you can just appoint all the commissions with complete overwhelming power to destroy any company. We think that that's just unreasonable to expect that to happen. We think that it is likely that political parties that are competing with each other will try to produce some sort of a consensus decisions as to what kind of media companies are bad for them in the long term. And political parties, it's not that they really want to have to spend huge amounts of money battling these companies. We think that it's likely that the kind of reasonable decisions will happen. Yes, they will probably reflect interest of these parties in power, but we think that those interests are likely to be on the same direction. Opening opposition says big businesses, you still have free markets. This is just that we're not true in saying in saying that competition doesn't exist. Amazon, Alibaba, and all these companies have collective interests of screwing up the local retailer. They have collective interest of screwing up the people on the comparative smaller business. The inherent thing about big businesses is that they want to limit the competition coming up. Yes, there is Facebook, there is Twitter, there is Apple, but they all collectively want to agree that smaller startups shouldn't succeed, or you should be able to buy them out. So large companies inherently have greater interest in proliferating their power. It's just not true that because you have competition, it means that that competition is perfect. Lastly, on their economic benefits, the problem is that it's not comparative. They say cheaper products. The reason why these companies have cheaper products is two-sided. First is because they just destroy competition, and therefore smaller businesses are unable to come up with cheaper products. And secondly, because it is a discounted benefit to the future. You offer a consumer, like you flood the Amazon market with extremely cheap goods in order to make the consumer buy them. And then when competition is dead, you can raise those prices at the point in the future when politicians are unable to limit you. This is why cheap products is just not comparative. On the safety net for technological competition, this is also kind of symmetrical. We're talking about safety net for Google glasses to be able to make Google glasses. The problem is the existence of Google limits the ability of smaller companies like glasses that is not Google to come up to the space, because they are instantly acquired by larger companies with no political oversight over them, because the political process that selects these people in the first place gets rigged. So technologically, there is no benefit as to the fact that smaller that larger companies can get them. It's more likely to happen that large companies just buy out huge number of patents and just limit the ability of those institutions to have any kind of limitation on them. So I'm going to make it like, maybe our case was a bit confusing. I'm going to make it very clear with one specific example. AT&T owns Warner Media. Warner Media owns HBO. HBO creates Game of Thrones. In the status quo, the company that connects your phone to the internet, AT&T, can throttle your speed of connection to Netflix because it wants you to watch Game of Thrones. A consumer here is directly harmed because there is no competition. To make competition happen, you need Federal Telecommunications Commission to constantly monitor what AT&T is doing. You need Federal Trade Commission to limit those mergers and acquisitions in the first place. What happens when big companies consolidate? AT&T bought Warner Media a few years ago. It gets the ability to have huge amounts of resources to lobby. Secondly, it gets the incentives to lobby to destroy competition. I will take closing before. Closing?
In 84, AT&T was break up in the 8 small branches. Can you tell us what was the outcome of this and how this support your case to prove that that will be effectively in current situation?
Well, yeah, so AT&T was broken up and consolidated again, but that's not like on the comparative, you would have seen the consolidation happening even earlier. We think that that's not comparative. So in the status quo, if AT&T has incentives to buy out huge number of politicians in order to appoint people to the Federal Trade Commission and to the Federal Telecommunications Commission. How does breaking up AT&T fix it? Note here, the problem is not only with money, because money is also part of it. Because AT&T and Warner Media are two separate companies now, you actually have less money to lobby politicians. But more importantly than that, AT&T doesn't have incentives to promote the existence of Warner Media and HBO because it's no longer a single company. The exact unique benefit that we are solving by breaking up companies is that they could not leverage their interest in one particular platform into another platform at the point in which this happens. This is exactly the same for huge companies that were in 2000s in post-communist countries that were able to have like oil interests promoting through media companies. And when that doesn't happen, when those companies are broken up, you are not able to get those instruments of pressure, and you simply don't have the incentives for pressure. We make the competition far better on our side of the house at the point in which these companies don't have those incentives. We're very proud to.
We thank the speaker for the speech. To continue the debate, we'd like to call the Deputy Leader of Opposition. Here.
Am I audible?
Yeah.
3, 2, 1. Look, in the end of the day, it is entirely unclear to us why our opposition is unwilling to admit that every single problem they have can be regulated. If they say that there is no way to set a reasonable limit for lobbying, then ban all lobbying by private actors like we do in Germany. There's absolutely nothing stopping us from forbidding lobbying and giving all reasonably sized parties the same chunk of funding that is then federally given. We don't understand why, in order to prevent lobbying, we need to break up companies that are deemed by a political actor to be dangerous to the democratic process. Note that at the point where they say any small party can veto this, they lose almost all their power, because there isn't a Congress in the world where the right and the left agree on which of these companies should be broken up and which not. Note, however, that if it is that one side has a reasonably powerful side, there is absolutely nothing that stops Donald Trump from going after Jeff Bezos by breaking up Amazon, because he happens to think that Jeff Bezos is someone who's being very mean to him in the Washington Post. We don't understand what exactly is to stop Donald Trump from doing that when he's also able to do this with USPS. We have no idea which democratic institution stops him from enacting a law so generally and so vaguely formulated that anything that is a threat to the democratic process. Note we explicitly POI opening opposition on this. Note Hadal explicitly points this out. There isn't a single line of response in Alisher's speech to actually explain us what stops politicians from doing this, other than some vague mechanism for how this maybe could be prevented, which is then just as easily as we can say, so prevent lobbying. At that point then, at least in terms of the abuse part, in countries where abuse is possible, this law is going to do disproportionately more harm than good in almost every instance, because it basically means that companies become political extension tools of politicians rather than just acting within the economic interest of the people, because at that point they actually become far more beholden to the government than they do to the economy. Because note, all the other things Alisher outlines, such as AT&T throttling the speed for Netflix, that is already illegal. In fact, the FCC stopped that before Trump put his big mug guy in charge of the FCC in order to, stop the FCC from coming down as a regulator. We say that regulation actually works phenomenally. It works excellently. It just matters that we do it. Note that actually enacting regulation is also, as Hadal already explains to you, far easier, because it is a far lower limit to say you can't do this than it is to say, like, arbitrary border we put in place of where we will break you up for reasons that are not entirely see-through. We will, unless you don't do what we like. This is essentially what this will read like to companies, and therefore companies will simply do whatever it is the government tells them to, exactly because of what opening government tells us, which is that this is a very big threat to companies, meaning these companies will at this point only do what the government wants. Meaning that suddenly, if Twitter is, which they highlight as a good company, is fact-checking the president of the United States, is closing his tweets, is stopping him from spreading false news, at the point where that's the impact they want, that impact becomes far less likely. And so if this debate, which they have largely put in the United States for reasons that are not entirely clear, but let's say for argument's sake that is where it should be, we think that even then, under their metric, we're still better off. But note, however, additionally, not yet. Note, however, additionally, that we say from our side that even if this is somewhat a wash and regulation is just as good as threatening to break them up, and this were just as well, there's still no actual response on the economic front. Because here are a couple of responses on the economic front. First of all, just the economy at large. Hadal already highlights to you that the US economy is largely funded by 10 companies. Note that currently the only reason that the stock market in the US, and therefore the stability of their economy, hasn't collapsed is essentially 10 companies that are pulling up the economy all along them. These companies are Alphabet, Google, Amazon, Apple, Facebook, Johnson & Johnson, I forget the others, but I've named more than 6. I feel like I'm fine. These companies are essentially single-handedly dragging the economy alongside them and increasing trust of people to spend money in an otherwise crumbling economy. Do you know what happens when the economy crumbles? People starve, people go lose their jobs, people lose their homes, and suddenly you have a country that is not only suffering from corona or whatever it is at the time, but suddenly you have a massive recession coming your way that is the size of the Great Depression, in which hundreds of thousands of people starved to death. That is the comparative in terms of what the economic impact is. Note that they tell us but competition is just like good. And, you know, the small actors would otherwise just sprout up and compete with Google if only they were allowed to. First of all, note that that's not really under democratic process. Secondly, when a company acts anti-competitively, and specifically Google doesn't actually buy too many companies because they're already afraid of regulators under the current metric of buying too many companies and getting too big. Google is super happy when a new company opens up a new market so they can release one of their future tech things where they're already 20 years ahead in terms of technological development of any other company on earth. They're just waiting for other companies to come up with new stuff, so they're not going to be regulated against. We think this is particularly important then because we think that that it's generally speaking preferable for companies to be able to actually make to actually produce things that benefit the consumer, and specifically under the regulations that already no, Hadal took you from CG, specifically under the regulations that already, you know, came from specifically under the regulations that are already in place in terms of every consumer needing to, you know, make dollar benefits. Opening government can't just get away from, you know, the definition of the info slide that says that current consumer laws already protect the dollar value of every single individual within an economy. Opening government.
All right, so how Trump would easily break up everything if his power is limited at best to replacing a couple of academics that die of old age out of 100 others working in this institute that we do create. How can he just snap every company that he wants?
Not a mechanism. That's not a model that you presented in either of your speeches when it's specifically challenged, but even if that were the case, even if somehow that's the case, it's very easy for him to do, just like he replaced every other head in every other regulatory body to take, I will take another academic that I listen to, instead someone that happens to, you know, provide my my findings. The same way he chose his economic advisor, the same way he chose all his other advisors. We have no idea what exactly is to stop him from doing exactly that. Note this is also something we see in other parts of the world. We see that when laws are vaguely phrased, we see this with the anti-terror bill in the Philippines. What we see there is a law that generally protects, allows the government wide overview over arresting people who are connected to terrorism. But what connected to terrorism means is something that's entirely up to definition for the government, which has led to a plethora of demonstrators of pro-LGBT and other human rights issues being arrested specifically because they oppose the Duterte regime. We think at the point where this is something that enables governments, generally speaking, to enforce anti-democratic and fascist policies, we think on the comparative, even if every single economic impact they say is true, and even if we couldn't regulate it, that in and of itself is a reason to not pass this bill. Proud to stand in opposition.
We thank the speaker for the speech. To open, to continue the debate, we'd like to call the member of government, if I'm correct. Here.
Okay, sure. A few minutes to wrap up my sheets. A few seconds, sorry. Okay. Am I audible?
Yeah.
All right, so I'll be paying attention to the chat space. If you have any POI, kindly type out POI, and then I would accept you when I'm ready. Okay, so starting in 3, 2, 1. Note that the major threat to democracies is not necessarily government lobbying, because just like opening opposition tells you, counter lobbying exists to be able to check that. The major threat of corporations to democracy is data surveillance, very pervasive data surveillance, very pervasive voter manipulation, etc. Those things are things that counter lobbying cannot solve, because you don't need a counter lobby. A counter lobby cannot stop Facebook from selling data to a corporation to be able to manipulate votes, etc. That tells you that open opposition's only metric to say, well, counter lobbying exists to be able to stop these things doesn't work, because the most pervasive harms to democracy is manipulating data and manipulating voter choices and influencing how they cast their votes when they would have done otherwise, because that's the biggest threat to democracy in terms of voting, right? But we need to give you a policy framework within this debate, which after that, we'll go ahead to give you justifications for why this policy is reasonable. So this is the policy framework that exists. First of all, there exists state legislature with the inspiration drawn from democratic legislature to be able to handle these corporations. But then COO says, well, they support states, note that antitrust laws will still exist in both worlds. The same way antitrust laws in today's world are able to target the right corporations to be able to hold them accountable, that same way this legislation can be able to target the right corporations. So you can't just get up and say, well, antitrust laws can exist for customer welfare, but it can't exist for corporations that are pervasive, that are threatening to democratic principles. We think that's inconsistent. But secondly, these companies are usually obvious, so you don't need a heated debate to be able to determine them, right? But thirdly, most committees in themselves are bipartisan and usually arrive at a consensus, so it's not entrenched in partisan politics like they say. But thirdly, public accountability due to the growing concerns of consumers and the social practices of corporations is another way to be able to make sure that these corporations get to break down. So even if we are to concede to some level of extent that the legislature is not so effective 100%, we think that people's ability, when we put out such information, to be able to call for the breakdown and redress from these corporations is also a very strong way to be able to make this policy framework work, because in that instance, corporations have no choice than to bow to the needs of their consumers, especially when there are much more growing concerns about the social practices of corporations, whether they are using child labor, etc. When we're able to prove that they are obstructing justice and disturbing democratic practices, consumers are much more likely to call on them. This is checking mechanisms from the people, and this is how our policy framework is going to work. But second thing is, why on a comparative, right, why threats to democratic process are even far more harmful than welfare, consumer welfare, for which reason we should pay huge attention to it, right? 3 reasons. First of all, threats or harms are usually evaluated on 2 extents, in terms of numbers and in terms of the extent of that harm, right? If you look at numbers, economic welfare, when breached, is one that is targeted to a specific consumer base who consume those products, which means they are less in number because they are restricted to a specific product. When democratic processes are obstructed, it affects every single citizen in the country, and so citizens have no control over their only means of determining how state resources are used, which highly disenfranchises these people. Because what it does is 2 things. First of all, these big corporations already exploit them economically, and I'll show you why that exists. But secondly, you take away their only political rights to correct the economic injustice, so people are put in a state of no alternatives. This is why when there exist democratic threats, they are much more pervasive, that we need to pay attention to them. Secondly, on the extent of the reach of the harm, if you look at economic welfare, product usage is usually in a specific area of your life, and sometimes even insignificant areas, right? Because most of these products are single product usages. Democratic principles or democratic practices are ones that influence legislative laws and policies that affect all aspects of the lives of people, their social lives, political lives, economic lives, etc. Which means that when there is harm and threat to democratic principles, the extent of the harm is far more expansive than the mere product, the welfare and the customer welfare. Which means that even on a comparative scale of priority, if everyone concedes that customer welfare is important, then there is no way you can deny that a threat to democracy is one that can be easily boycotted, right? But thirdly, without protected democratic processes, consumer welfare policies and antitrust laws in themselves do not work, because antitrust laws are usually archaic and hardly evolve. This blindsides a lot of states and government laws and grow very big, and these corporations use that blindsided nature to grow very big and then obstruct the use of democratic principles to implement these particular consumer welfare policies. Just like the info slide tells you, they grow very big and have a lot of political influence to be able to even prevent the kind of laws that protect consumer welfare from working. That is the kind of harms that democratic threats pose. I'll take a POI from CEO before I analyze the impacts.
The motion is not ban destroying. How you prevent this data breach, surveillance, and how you impact the breakup if, for example, Facebook and Instagram become two smaller companies, how you are achieving all of your benefits on this mechanism.
Okay, cool. So 2 responses, and my impact analysis is going to do that, right? But secondly, we think that when you break them up and they are smaller, it's easier to control them because then they have very few control over the states in terms of their economic power, their lobbying power, etc. But secondly, I'm going to show you how there's a much more likelihood on our side for companies not to go to the extent of breaching consumer privacy and very pervasive data practices, right? First impact in our world is that we have a mechanism that first of all places a bar of deterrence on corporations, because then corporation knows that a state have taken a firm stance on these issues, and so that intrinsically places a bar of deterrence that corporations are more likely to work towards meeting and not necessarily breaking. But secondly, even in instances where they break those boundaries, it gives us room for redress when the harms are already caused. The reason why that harm is much more pervasive in their world is that there is no means for redress. So we put the burden on corporations to check their actions and set up good standard practices in good faith, which means we still give them freedom to act, but states only restrict their harms. States only restrict them when the harms are caused to a third party, which is in principle legitimate. We can't preemptively restrict their expansion, like you guys say, and economic benefits. And so what we need to do is to give them the opportunity to address these problems internally and make sure that they do not cross the lines that states set for them, especially when states have a legitimacy to control or restrict and influence the private economy in instances where there is maximum harm. We've never been this proud to propose.
We thank the speaker for the speech. I think that was like 8 minutes. We thank the speaker for the speech. We call the member of opposition. Here.
Audible to all?
Yeah.
Okay. Okay, so let's start with a little bit of the rebuttal of the second table. Basically, a very classic case, but the speaker suggested 2 specific threats to democracy and some conditions, because we are still very unclear what are the real criteria, what the threat to a democracy is. It's in the eye of the beholder. We all have kind of different ideas what democracy should be. We all kind of think it should serve us. So 2 things, data surveillance and voter manipulation. Let's focus on both of those. Data surveillance, how? Like, how exactly is breaking up changing anything? I'll get to this. It absolutely doesn't. I don't think the speakers even attempted to substantiate this point. Nothing changes in data surveillance economy. No incentives change for any of the actors. Literally nothing changes. Second thing, voter manipulation. If the speaker, if anybody on the government has actually evidence or any substantiations that these companies actually consciously do anything of this sort of voter manipulations, please step forward with the evidence. It's everything about voter manipulation is outside actors who are independent of those companies and just use their platforms, use their mechanism, use their algorithms to push those things. Clearly, this is not something that breaking up into 3-4 companies, which algorithms are going to be eerily the same, because this is the thing that society wants. This is what we're asking of these companies. Nothing is going to change. So voter manipulation is, and data surveillance are absolutely moot points from the from. Okay, next, these companies are like visible, etc. Like to me, like the 2 problems are not big tech. It's like thousands of ad marketplaces, it's data brokers, it's professional mischief organizations like the FSB. those are the companies that will happily switch to a smaller Instagram, which will have smaller capacity to deal with this like strong arm attack against our democratic principles than a bigger company, which it isn't in its interest publicly to be accused of voter manipulation. Those companies have suffered strongly PR losses. They may not really care about them that much, but they want to be perceived as friends of democracy, and they're actively trying to do so, sitting on the these congressional committees. None of this is gone, so basically nothing changes. I have no idea what else was there in. Okay, but back to our case. Like, saying something is big in a democracy and that they have a lot of lobbying power is really little for a debate of this type. Like, basically, this is the entire mechanism that we have been tried to be solved. AT&T or IBM did not defeat democracy, even though their like competitive positions was probably stronger than actually Facebook and Google right now in their specific niches. AT&T was actually broken up into 2 8-baby bells, which happened. What happened next? Inside 10-15 years, the concentrations happen again because AT&T had the same structural mechanism, know-how, advantages, expertise, which allow them, and obviously we're not going to take away the huge money behind the owners, so basically they can freely concentrate in a new way, waiting for the regulators to like wake up again and try to break them up again. So antitrust is about 3 things. Primarily, actually are going to probably lower. We actually, with breaking up, are going to make them higher because the network effects that bring us the free services will actually be worse for the majority of companies that are going to operate in those markets. They're going to have to sell to those data brokers at lower prices. Now, the only basically happy party if we would break up Facebook and Instagram would be advertisers, and big advertisers who spend a lot of money, because their competitive positions would actually grow in comparison to those tech companies. So now you're actually giving a lot of leeway to other like external actors. So this action is not without its consequence. The final point, an interesting one, is competition, but I don't think that actually we solve this here, and we're gonna prove it to you why. All industries are regulated in one way or another. They all have, many of them have industry-specific regulations as well. Like, the internet was absolutely chock full of hate speech in the early 90s. I've been there, it sucked, but like definitely like nothing substantively changed, just the scale of what is happening. So now regulation can be wildly different, and we think that it is absolutely, unquestionably a better way to like try to tackle those problems, which can be very real. So regulating banks, for example, is not just regulating the banks. It's regulating mortgages, credit cards. It's regulating lending practices, all the specific elements that are the areas where the power of the banks are actually probably arising, which is like the government actually is trying, like, for example, to fix automotive safety issues in the 50s by breaking up Chrysler. It's trying to defeat problems of parking and congestion in the cities by breaking up like Tesla and Ford right now. These are all second stage effects which can be better addressed by regulation at the core of the mechanism, which brings those companies the competitive power in the first place, because many companies can lobby, like smaller companies can like enter into lobbying alliances. The lobbying point isn't really that interesting. I don't want to talk about it. Okay, so next, should Google split up? Like let's get like to the nitty gritty. If we split up Google into YouTube, search, and ads businesses, for example, this constitutes a couple of fun things. First, the owners do not really suffer that much. They can like spin off like the least profitable business, keep my equity in the most important parts, and reshuffle, knowing that the regulators are not going to have the appetite to strongly regulate me anytime soon, just after I have been broken up. So like basically the same with Instagram, only the advertisers and owners will be happy. So finally, concentration itself is not as critical as the network effect of specific mechanism, and it is avoiding real policy making. But when we think that like arbitrarily, kind of arbitrarily, because we don't have good criteria set up by the government, arbitrarily breaking them up is actually the answer. Hell, some actors are actually going to be harmed with this situation, they're going to be weaker in combating those issues that you highlight because they're going to be slower. So the key question is, if we break up the big techs, will the mechanism that perpetually work anyway, but this time in 3 or 4 places, still keep harming democracy? Probably yes. No competitor will be able to like invent new Google algorithm or like fantastic YouTube database of videos or 2 billion of Facebook clients. Nothing changes for those small companies and allow them to still do the same practices without any change, and because they know that those work. And if we break up big tech, will democracy actually be better? So the tragic thing here is that after all those speeches by the government, I still don't know. It's kind of like hugely depends on the specific threat to a specific democracy from a specific company that has a specific mechanism that brings them power. But we cannot debate this on such a level of generality. So in this level of generality, yeah, maybe break them up. But before we make such a decision, I think that this level of vagueness should not stand in this debate.
We thank the speaker for the speech. To continue the debate, we'd like to call the government whip. Here.
Hello, can you hear me, please? Can you hear me?
Yeah, we can. Yes.
That's great. All right, so let me set up the timer. So I begin in 3, 2, 1. From closing governments, I think our case is very simple. How are we able to maintain business freedom for them to be able to engage in all of their practices and create wealth while still protecting the consumers and our very core values of democracy? And that's why you should not take closing opposition serious in this debate. They commit 2 grievous offenses. First of all, CEO basically denies the reality of this debate. They are the only team that does not engage in the reality of this debate. What they say is that the harms or the threats to democracy do not exist at all. Recognize that this is different from opening opposition, who says that the metrics of gaining these things are difficult to determine. CEO basically denies the Facebook scandal, which necessarily came with Cambridge Analytica, denies the Brexit voter manipulation, Nigel Farage's confession. He denies everything, and that is a debate which we cannot have. That necessarily means this debate does not happen because the debate concedes to necessarily a harm that exists on that metric. Secondly, they focus all of their analysis on the effects of breaking up companies. Notice that in their world, breaking up of companies does not disappear. There's a mechanism there's a condition by which they break up companies. That is when they harm consumer welfare. It means that for all of their impacts to stand, it means that companies need to have unrestricted access and their behaviors need to be unrestricted. It means you get all of the harms of abuses to the consumer, destroying the environment, destroying the climate, repression of competitors. They argue for a no rules world for corporations because what they basically say is that when you break down these companies, it is bad, so don't do it. That means that we don't break up these companies. There's no mechanism. At least OO says use regulation. CEO gives you nothing in this debate. There's no way CEO ranks above any other team in this debate, if we are being fair. Let me move on to opening opposition. There are 3 things opening opposition does. They say, oh, well, let's use the alternative of regulations, right? And then we get 2 benefits, economic benefits, and then you have political manipulation. 3 responses. Contrast their alternative with the 2 impacts which they themselves bring. So they say regulations, and recognize that they still are able to break up companies depending on the threats to customer welfare. But first of all, regulations still mean that political manipulations can still happen and politicians can still hijack these systems to be able to hunt. So all of the abuses which they talk about still happen in their worlds when they still have regulations like bans, fines, increased taxes. All these things significantly also affect the economic benefits which they talk about. They do not remove it completely. The best argument they get is on the comparative, which they do nothing to prove. Therefore, if any addition, any credit to that case will mean that you are extending their case for them, even as a judge. It means as a judge, you cannot be convinced by that case. It means politicians are still able to demonize, target, tweak. Their model is vaguely uncomparative. The second thing you need to note is that Also, because we never restrict the creation of a law because of the presence of bad actors. You don't say that there will be the existence of bad actors will not create laws. Like, it is not a jungle, right? They themselves release the economic benefits. That in itself is a huge incentive not to harm these companies arbitrarily. But secondly, realize that companies also have legal personhood where they can defend themselves in court. So it's not a jungle where you say you set up a law and politicians use it anyhow. These companies can defend themselves. Therefore, that manipulation does not happen. There's none of OO's benefits stand in this debate. I don't know how you would place them. Thirdly, specifically in your world, there are metrics for determining where consumer welfare has been breached, which Andrews tells you. Andrews tells you that these models are decided on democratically by legislature or representation of all of the people. It means that these things cannot be unfair, like how OO wants to do it. It's as if people just sit down and do these things. These things involve all of us as a people getting to be able to decide. I don't see how you get a benefit from up, because none of their harms are mutually exclusive to our side. It happens on their side too. What you rather get from our case, where comparatively we are better, is that Andrews proves why we need it. It tells you that there's an evolutionary trend where there is a need, where customers have become dissatisfied with companies who abuse social issues. So there's demand for corporate accountability is rising. Customers are much more concerned about how Nike is treating its way, be able to cover up these issues of also
Hello. You're freezing up a bit.
These democratic principles. I take one last.
Yeah. No. Can we pause? Can we pause your speech?
Yeah, I can hear you.
You were breaking up around 4:30, 4 minutes and 30 seconds. You were discussing about.
Can you remember what I was saying within the period? Can you remember what I was saying within the period?
All right. I mean, you're still breaking up.
You're still breaking.
You're still breaking up a bit. So can you still say like 1, 2, 3 mic test? So just recheck your connection. I think he's gonna reconnect. Yeah.
Can you hear me?
Yes. Can you like say 1, 2, 3, 4, 5?
1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10.
All right. All right. So I stopped your time at around 4:30. The last thing I heard was something about the need to hold accountable companies that abuse something, like explaining your team's.
All right, sure. So let me go to that. So I start in 1, 2, 3. What Andrews explains to you is that the scope of consumer welfare has expanded to the point where they are more concerned about their social issues than about rights. It means that there's increasing level of accountability that is being demanded from corporations. So more consumers are concerned about how Louis Vuitton or Nike is treating its workers in Vietnam or across the supply chain. They're putting that responsibility on them. Therefore, there is a need for those laws to evolve to be able to cover up these concerns of customers. So I take you one last chance.
We proved that even if proposition could magically fiat a perfectly regulated committee, the mere fear of politicization would be enough to alter companies' actions. CO adds that the regulations we proved to work are better than the motion that they proved ineffective and we proved to be actively harmful. Please engage.
Listen. There are metrics by which we arrive by the fact that there are violations to consumer welfare. These metrics are democratic. Secondly, we should assume, everyone concedes in this debate, that these corporations live in a democratic setting. That's where Google, Facebook live in America, where it's the strongest democracy. You can't admit to political manipulation when these guys have legal personhood and can be able to fight in courts, especially when they are being targeted. Unless you say America practices a jungle justice system, which of course I leave to the judges to decide, right? So how is our mechanism able to create these impacts uniquely, especially coming from my member speech? First of all, we are able to create a general deterrence. Recognize that the way economic interactions happen in democratic states is the level where the government feels it does not need to interfere in their businesses, in the day-to-day activities of businesses. It means it gives them that kind of autonomy to engage in these practices. What that means is that governments never intercede except there is active harm to third-party individuals. And that is essentially why you have such a model as this. So it means that whenever you break up a company, you cannot say that, oh, it's unfair to the company, or this company gives us money, so let us stop. The point is that there are active harms to other individuals, and therefore government is justified to be able to intervene. But then what this has, the broader impact this has is to serve as a huge deterrence, which Andrew tells you. It means, what this means is that you have a better business landscape. It means companies are now in a position to know or to be able to determine that their activities will cause harm. Because in status quo, governments cannot be able to determine if Facebook is going to cause harms to our democracy in the next 5 years or not. But Facebook is in a position to know, they have that knowledge. So because of that knowledge, they are culpable because they have knowledge of their day-to-day activities. It means there's better regulation of the day-to-day activities because this serves as a huge deterrence that if you begin to infringe on our fundamental human rights and democracy, we are going to break you down. This sets up a better business landscape where everyone's human rights is protected. That means that all of the economic benefits which they talk about is still secured. Panel, there's no way where else you vote this debate than on Gov side, specifically closing governments. Thank you.
We thank the speaker for the speech. To continue the debate, we'd like to call the opposition whip. Here.
Am I audible?
Yeah.
3, 2, 1. I'm so tired of strawmanning and bizarre rebuttal which coming in this competition. Closing government literally accuse us of denying the reality of the debate, and they never check what David contested from their case. I will repeat that because they didn't add much more analysis in their way. They said that the biggest problem with the democracy is data surveillance and the voters manipulation. We said that your mechanism, it's not solving that at all because they didn't prove the crucial ring, right? What will happen with this data surveillance after you break these companies? It's still unclear after whole Gov bench how, when you separate Instagram from Facebook, you have different types of regulations on that companies, right? Like why you are changing their incentives, why they will not collectivize the data of the users. But second of all, if you have proofs that Facebook is responsible as a company for all of the voters manipulation, just put them to fucking jail and ban them or not breaking them up, right? Just literally, we don't do this now because we have no proof and we are just seeing using the small mechanisms which allow us to enter and use that to our own business. This will be even more prevalent if you break up all of these companies with keeping exactly the same problematic mechanisms, exactly the same loopholes which other actors are using. What is our extension is to say, if you have this strong power, you are much more effectively to doing the regulations, right? Because you have centralized this. You can put you can check all of the single mechanisms which later reflect in the problems which happening in the current market, in the current democratic system. So responding to CG and being charitable, you can't win debate on market of ideas and saying that will be nice thing to do, or that it's a nice idea, or this is the problem. You need to prove why your solution is solving this problem and how you are coming to the outcome of this and how people are changing or like companies' incentives. Let's move to OG and spend more time on them. The first question, which I still have is, if they are so concerned about fake news or some kind of algorithms, what kind of algorithms will happen now on Instagram compared to Facebook on any other information platform? Like how you are influencing the change, what will replace that, what kind of information will people receive? It's unclear. And also what will be the benefit for these users or how you will repair this democracy. It's really unclear for me. But second of all, they say, competition, it's problematic and no access for small companies. which small companies will enter the markets which you analyze. I think it's much more entry barriers, right? You can't be like, oh, I will create the informatics startup and tomorrow I will enter the stock market and I will get million viewers and that's how I solve a lot of problems. It's unclear what are the benefits or like tangible benefits on side the government. But moreover, I think what is problematic, it's you can't take both, right? You can't break these companies and they said, we will firstly break you up, just sell on the cheaper prices because you need to you need to decentralize and you need to create few branches, and then we additionally impose 6 different regulations to prevent you from other actions. That's the moment which the lobbying power of these companies will become pissed, right? That's the moment when you stop accepting these regulations and when you try to find the way to obey the law and when you said that this is too much, right? Because you will start to create losses, but also that will be something which didn't create any tangible benefits on their side of the house. So I think that's an important rebuttal from closing opposition towards opening government scenario. But then they never actually respond to our first POI, right? They never say why in the long term you will be capable to keep that kind of benefits and how you will still create these companies separately. Our response to this is, if you will split these companies into small ones and still try to regulate them, you are less effective, you are much slower in your actions, but also the same problematic mechanisms just spilled to 6 different branches and are not sorted out. So it's unclear how the situation become better on your side of the house. I think it's also extremely important to respond on both government teams. They just gave the example in OG, and I want to be very clear, example, that might be oil companies and then we will break them up. Neither of their analysis applied to that types of companies. They were fully focused on the democracy, on the informations and fake news when they forgot to add the important link, how the change happened and how they're solving a lot of the problems. So I think they should be judged for what they presented in the debate and not what they wanted to present in the debate and how they wanted to make the debate much larger. I think it's extremely important now to say what we bring to the debate compared to opening opposition. Because I think opening opposition fairly challenged opening government. I think they spent too much time to contest their fiat and how fair that might be in terms of abusive power, because I think we are taking them at their best. Like, even if you share these companies properly, the incentive of people who are holding these companies and people who want to make profit and business and who are investing on the market will be pissed and will not allow you to make the regulation later, which is probably the more important impact on that side of the house. I think, second of all, a lot of the benefits from opening opposition are not mutually exclusive to this particular breakup of companies, right? Because they will probably still be profitable for the economy and for the market. So therefore, the nuance of our case is to say what is the antitrust law and why we believe that these criteria are much more effective and much more productive in the long term. I will take OG now.
In the status quo, you can break up companies according to consumer welfare standards, while changes in price are also very vague, futuristic, and hard to predict. However, you don't see companies being randomly broken down due to either political will or miscalculation because the cost of an illegitimate action is too high for politicians to handle. That's why they don't do that ever.
If our criteria are vague, which you need to also support on your side of the house because you can't deny the breakup, you should spend significant more time to explain how the deemed democracy, its objective metric, how this is regulated in particular countries, but also how this is something comparatively better than the numbers and then the active harm to the consumers which you are trying to do. Consumers have zero benefits when you are doing your kind of actions, right? If you are breaking up these companies, because they also don't have the access to data, and they are subject of exactly the same mechanism which you think were problematic in the first place. Panel, I think it's ludicrous that government never justified what is their clear metric, and they're accusing our metric of being unclear, especially when that is also on their side of the house and they can't deny antitrust law. Second of all, I think it's problematic when they are saying, oh, democracy is so important, fake news, but they never make this type of analysis how their mechanism and how their motion is solving that in the long term. Even if problem exists, please sort that in a more effective way, which will directly target the democracy and not other businesses. Yay.
We thank the speaker for that speech, and we thank all the speakers for the debate. Given that, I think everybody